So we want to talk about something here today. We want to talk about graphic user design this week. We're actually going to then on Wednesday, we're going to have, well, in class we'll get to experiment with it in class. Out of class, obviously, you get a benefit from our experience with that. And we're actually going to design a app for a phone of some sort. And so we're going to look at some of the tools that are out there. And the reason we're concentrating on the phone is the fact that the mobile market is so big now that that has become a primary concern for a lot of industries. We have to create a model that will work on the phone and then literally expand it up to work on desktops in this case. In a lot of cases, we work on that model. The old model, so if I were to go back 7 or 8 years ago, we created a desktop model, and if it happened to work on a mobile device, great. And so you'll see it called a lot of different terms, this idea of responsive design. And some things we do really, really well. Some are interesting. So if you view Peru State College's website as an example, it looks okay on a phone, but it loses some functionality. For example, the search is hard to get to if you look at it on a phone, whereas on the desktop that search is fairly prominent, and you can use that as a tool to navigate around. And it's becoming more important, especially on a lot of websites, how we interact and how we deal with them. So we want to talk about a couple of different pieces in here today. So we want to look at what kind of user graphic information pieces do we want? Why do we look at older style things? So we want to base it on that idea of we want people to be able to use our tools. And we're going to introduce you to this idea that you've probably had in other classes called that storyboard. And you think, oh man, I hate to do this. I just want to design something and I want to throw it out there. But being able to design it, in a lot of cases you have committees and other people you need to present these ideas to. Those storyboards are a really great way. And I know we all grimace. We go, man, I just don't want to do those. And I've seen from teaching the web design course previously that storyboards are they're kind of like discussion boards. Nobody wants to do them, but yet they're really, really important. So we really have a couple of different models. So we want to model really off the idea of that user experience. So how do we interact with the system and our actor or our user in a meaningful way? And we've all run into systems that will drive us crazy. And Blackboard is a great example of, there are some things in Blackboard that drive me absolutely batty from a user experience. So everything I do in Blackboard, I get an OK box that says, okay, did you really want to do that? Yes, I did. Click, yes, I did. And I can't turn it off. And so that user dialogue sometimes is a little over the top. Now the reality is, in a lot of cases, it makes sense. Do you want to delete all this student's grades? Great, put a checkbox up. If I'm just updating one grade, it's probably not necessary. So we really want to focus on those end users. And I suspect that in Blackboard you have some similar types of issues as a student where you go, man, I wish I could do this. And we don't have that idea. So the reality is what we're trying to come up with is a user-friendly, in other words, we want to tick off our users as least as possible. And that's kind of an odd thing because we're always going to make somebody frustrated with our efforts. We want to do it as least as possible. So that user interface may be on a lot of different things. So it may be on a computer screen. It may be printed output. So we have to think about all those pieces that are going to interact with our user interface. So are there other applications that interact with it, that lay on top of it, beside it, next to it? How do I deal with those? So we may have mobile equipment. We may need to think about what our users are actually using. We may need to think about what happens if a mobile device loses connection. Does it reset our entire app and we have to start over, or does it freeze some of that data so that we can move comfortably from hotspot to hotspot, for example? Maybe we have an issue in Blackboard, and I've seen this before where people have tried to use mobile devices connected to Blackboard, and a test will log them out because they hit a hotspot that wasn't connected, or they lost signal for a moment. Suddenly they're logged out, and their test gets automatically submitted. How do I deal with those kinds of things? How long do I put up things like advertisements? And that is coming up more and more frequently. On some of the devices, it is. It's hard to get the menus and different things. So we really do have to think about what those devices are and what we're looking at. So what sizes of screens? What are the buttons? What about colors? Are there any things in colors we need to be aware of? So a very large percentage of males are colorblind. So putting buttons that have different actions that are red and green, that's just cruel to somebody who's colorblind. So we need to look at that. And we don't necessarily talk about it in here, but if it's an outward public-facing GUI or an outward-facing system where the public has access, we need to worry about accommodations for people that are using things like JAWS screen readers. How do I deal with users who have hearing maybe they're hearing impaired, or maybe they don't have very great physical dexterity, and we put tiny little buttons that you can't hardly get to on a mobile device. So we need to think about all of those pieces as we start to put this together. So we have some different metaphors in here. So this idea of direct manipulation. So we manipulate objects that look like they really do. So we put pictures. So the best example, I think, of that is really the idea of a McDonald's cash register. And I don't know if any of you have worked there, but if you peek behind the screen, in most cases, they're actually seeing pictures of different hamburgers. It's a great way to quickly put in data. So the example here, we drag a folder to a trash can. So that Apple environment that brought us that trash can and actually dragging it back and forth. And so we have a couple of other ones, the desktop that we're really familiar with, and that document where we think of things as papers or folders. And if you use Microsoft OneNote, that's a great example of that idea of building a virtual notebook that you're going to use. And then, so maybe we have a dialogue where you interact and ask questions. So Microsoft's latest version of troubleshooting is that dialogue where it says, oh, you have a problem with your network. Have you tried this? Nope, that doesn't work. Let me try this for you. And you interact back and forth. So we have some examples there. So here's for example, our on screen. This was a copy of Windows. And suddenly we have two different objects here. So that dialogue where we're going back and forth. And then a lot of times we have gotten so conditioned because we've used these interfaces and these different pieces before, we know that this should be a specific item. So in this case, we see a trash can and we know, hey, that's where we file our trash. We see this play icon and we go, oh, that's some kind of a player. Now, whatever music player it is, didn't have to use that design convention of a stop button, a play button, and a fast forward backwards. And those have been around for a long time. They were on cassette decks, if you remember back that far. They've been on CD players. They've been on all different kinds of players. So we're used to that convention of, hey, I push that button and something plays. We've gotten conditioned to that idea. And then a lot of times we have these ideas where we add some kind of an interface where we can actually see it. So here, for example, we're creating a surround sound effect, and we have an example over here where we show the speakers or we show the theater so we can actually visually see what's going on. And sometimes that's a very useful tool for our end users. So other examples of that are these checkboxes. We can see that the checkbox is marked for true theater surround. Or we can see that a radio button is selected for living room in a virtual speaker mode. And so they give us that feedback that this is the option that's selected already, and we know what's up there. Or those pull-down menus, we can actually see this is what's selected. And those are really common. So one of the biggest things, and in fact, if you take anything out of this entire chapter, it's consistency. Users want consistency. They want it across the platform. They want it across applications. They want it within applications. So the worst one we have as an example is our friend Microsoft again. So Microsoft has some consistency across platforms a little bit. I'll give them that. But when the suite of applications, and the one that comes to mind is Microsoft Office, and most of them are fairly similar. So if I go to Word, and I go to Excel, and even if I go to PowerPoint, that ribbon interface is very similar across the top. But what happens when I go to Access? Does Access break that model and look a lot different? Yeah, it's not as consistent. And so we want that consistency. Users want that. When they want to click on File, Save As, they don't want to have to hunt for it. That should be something that we're used to, and it should be the same way across all the platforms. If we have a Send Message button, it should be in a consistent formula. And the other piece of that is users really like the idea of that even though we add new updates and new features, that it still appears consistent over releases. And so we nearly had companies go into war when Microsoft Office released 2007, where we replaced the traditional file menus with this ribbon interface. And we had to retrain users all over. And quite frankly, I would have thought that would have been a great time for a lot of companies to think, hey, let's change. Let's do something cheaper. Let's go to OpenOffice. Let's go to Google Docs at that time or something else. But people were still ingrained enough in Microsoft that they said, all right, we're going to stick with you and we're going to update to 2007. And so 2007 to 2016, they're fairly similar all the way across. So they have that continuity. So they haven't made any major changes in Office. But what did Microsoft do as another blunder? In fact, Windows 8. So we don't see a lot of references to Windows 8 except in our textbooks. Well, you can't go buy a new computer with Windows 8. And in fact, Windows 8 had updates to Windows 10 that you could actually get for free. And Windows 8 versus Windows 7, all of a sudden they replaced the Start button. And so the most common thing people did as soon as they got Windows 8 was they had a Start button replacement. And guess where we bundled all kinds of malware and other stuff? Right in those Start button replacements. But the interface changed. And they had some good ideas with it. The reality is, if Windows 8's interface had come first, it might have been more popular. Because now, where we have all these touch screens, now we have big, clear buttons, and developers can put models up here. We can change this around to have our apps right here. So instead of having to go up and into a menu and 3 screens in, I can click, boom, now I'm in Word. And we thought touch screens are going to be everywhere. And in fact, part of the premise of Windows 8 was the idea that tablets were going to be ubiquitous. And tablet sales when Windows 8 came out were on the rise. They were going to take over desktops. And guess what happened? Well, not really. Android's part of it. All of a sudden our phone screens got bigger. Because you got to remember when Windows 8 came out, your phone screen was about 2 inches by 2 inches. And now we have phone screens that are 7 inches across. It looks like you're holding up a tablet to your face. And in fact, it came out the term phablet. But suddenly that desktop and tablet interface started to fade a little bit. And there are some devices. I still have a tablet that runs Windows 8, upgraded to Windows 10, that still has kind of a tablet interface. And it works okay. But tablets didn't get the speed up, and they just kind of dropped. When people got the bigger phones, they could do nearly everything on a phone that you could do on a tablet. And tablets have that downside of they don't have a physical keyboard. And so then by the time you put a case with a keyboard on it, you're really at about the size of some of the small laptops. And that seems to have ended a lot of the tablets. So they're still popular and they're still usable and they're still sold, but if you look at the actual numbers, they're not increasing quite as much as what they were. Well, now we've come out with Windows 10. And Windows 10 kind of went back to a Windows 7 feel. It's got a Start button and a lot of the pieces are still there. So those users now are more comfortable with the latest version of Windows 10. Hopefully. And most of those are out. But Windows 10 still has a tablet mode, if you didn't know that. So if you have a a computer/tablet, you can run Windows 10 in a mode that looks very similar to this, where you've got those big buttons for your tablet. So I have a Lenovo Yoga that when I flip it over to go to tablet mode, I have it set up kind of very similar to this, because my big fat fingers on that tablet, I still need a little bit of direction. If I had the small little icons like on Windows 7, that touchscreen isn't doing me a lot of good. You'll see that happen. So we have a lot of other things that are fairly consistent. Those mouse hovers, where we hover over an item and it pops up tooltips or something about the item, that's fairly common to put into a GUI. Those built-in helps. So as soon as I hover my mouse over an area, then I get some kind of a help. So we also may want to put some kind of help menu right on a page or on a screen. Well, most of us are used to things like the swipe left or the right on a book, but we get some interfaces that sometimes are a little confusing. So if you haven't natively grown up using something like Snapchat, is there any way to tell what the heck you're doing in Snapchat? And you guys are all like, I use it all the time. I don't have any problem. Imagine your grandma trying to use Snapchat. Is there any way for her to understand if she swipes left, right, up, down, what's going to happen? So we've all got these ideas about what's going to happen, but we probably really need to have some documentation so we can see what's going to happen in that. And so sometimes some very easy self-documenting diagrams, pictures are on there. So things like the undo button, Control-Z or an undo button. That's so ubiquitous now. If it doesn't work in your app or in your particular web page or your application that you've developed, you're probably going to be a little sad. So just like web design, we need to think about those ideas of readable text. We've all gotten something or ran into a website that had that cartoon text or other things, and you know, you get an ad like this in your message or a piece of your code, and you're like, what in the world? And I know it's great. It looks creative, but simple fonts are far easier to read, and you want a lot of contrast. So depending on whether you're projecting this on a screen or you're looking at it on a computer screen, some of this text isn't going to stand out. That 6 p.m., especially on a projector, will tend to go away. So barbecue, I can't even read what this is. We'll provide hamburgers and other barbecue something. So think about that, looking at it, so you can read. So you want your text readable, and you also want navigation, especially if you're using some kind of a web browser-based system. You want that navigation very easy. So at the bottom, things like navigation buttons are at the top or wherever you put them, and a way to get back out from the screen you're in. The worst thing you can do to a user, and especially if you're allowing them to get to an area with a search and they can't get back out of it, then they have to go, oh man, I'm going to go back up to the home page. So think about that. We want to have simple ways to navigate, but those users who are very experienced in it, if we have shortcut keys, Control-Z, for example, great way to do it. And remember that most of the users aren't going to be as sophisticated as you. So here's an example of a fairly clean layout, and that's our RMO. So yes, it looks kind of like a template site, and there's a reason why we have thousands of those template sites. It works fairly well. Everything is accessible. I can quickly say, oh, I want to click on sales, and I know that that's going to pop open to another menu. If I look at women's apparel, it's going to bring a pop-up. We know how to work those. Those work fairly well. Sometimes we don't want to reinvent the wheel. So we're creating this application. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. We don't want to force customers to have to learn anything new. So we sometimes have menus and that idea of hierarchy. So depending on our needs, we often have menus that are more than one layer deep. So here's our ribbon layout again. And here we say, all right, well, we know somewhere in this review area, I want to put in highlights. So review makes sense, and then I can turn on track changes, and then we have a flyout menu from that. Well, if that flyout menu is consistent for every application, so it works in Word, it looks very similar in other versions of Office, that's really a great thing. And so we have that consistency, and we can get a lot of different items all pulled up here. Now, what we know, though, is we also want to look at what items are used most frequently and do some ordering based on that. Now, across all our apps, we want some consistency, though. So here we have a menu, and I brought up just a piece of it here. So we know that sale creation might have several pieces in its flyout menu. So search for items, view product, create sales. Our customer order control. Customers might want to be able to look up items, track shipments, create an item return, rate a product, provide suggestions, those kinds of things. So we're going to create documents. So this is part of that. I'm going to create this before I get that scoreboard. So I get there. So here, for example, might be an interface from our customer form. So notice in this case, we've probably built this on a rapid application development because clearly we only have 3 records available. So this record interface down here out of Access is pretty ubiquitous, the way it looks. Great. We have it a lot of places. So we've created a customer form. Looks fairly easy. I can save a new customer. And I can navigate through those. I can search. So all of these icons are very familiar. It's clean. It's uncluttered. So we have our team out there at a trade show. They don't need a ton of extra pieces. We need to barrel it down to what they need just for that customer form to add information about that. And so that's where this storyboard and that idea of creating that dialogue comes about. So you can look at them in a physical form. And some people storyboard electronically and they create samples. But a lot of times that paper and pencil is a quick way to sketch out how I'm going to do something and looking at that dialogue. So a lot of times we think, how is this interaction going to do? So here we have our system asking that question, hey, what do you want to do? So it's just sitting there. Well, what's the user going to do? I want to check out. I've got my items in my cart. I want to figure out how to check out. All right, what's your email? How am I going to identify you? So in our system, we must identify with an email. It could be an account number. It could be a username. But email is a fairly easy way to do it. And so it says, okay, my email address is this. Now, would we really have a login procedure at some point with a password? Yes. But in this case, it's going to confirm that information. So you've logged in and it says, yep, you must be Nancy Wells. It gives you that check to say, are you really who I think you are in our system? And so if you look at this and suddenly your address is different, then that might tell you there is something wrong with your account and it might stop you from ordering. So then the system goes, well, everything you decided to order is in stock. We can ship it today. Because your order is over a certain amount, we're going to ship it for free. Now that free shipping is the slow model, so you might want to speed it up a little bit. And so you can look at different shipping options. Now, how would you like your items to be shipped? Now, there's an obvious one in here that's kind of a strange thing, and I wonder how many times people do this. So, our order's over a certain amount, we can get free shipping. But I have seen them, what they do is they actually default to one of the other shipping options, right? And you'll actually end up paying. So in this case, if I send it through the post office, it's going to be $11.70 and ship in 5 to 7 days instead of 3 days. Does that make sense for us? As a customer, probably not. But as a business, what do you think the shipping cost really might be? If it's $10, do they make a small profit on that shipping? just something to look at when we create it. And more reputable companies will default things to, for example, the cheapest and fastest shipping versus the most expensive. And I have seen actually some slightly more high pressure in the tech industry ads. When you go to check out, what they actually do is they automatically put you in a 2-day or overnight shipping, and in some cases that is a very exorbitant cost. And if you're not noticing it, so in other words, they made it obtuse. So here we have a cart. So you go, oh yeah, I'm going to click on my cart so I can view it, empty it, or I'm going to check out. And so we go through kind of a storyboard here of what this would look like. Now, would our final result probably look exactly like this? No. But this gives us a way we can go into that committee if we have to deal with it, or our VP, or whoever's involved in this project, and say, all right, now here's our plan for this particular piece. And you think, well, man, that's a lot of overhead. I'm going to have to deal with and in a large corporation, you will have to deal with that for every piece. In a smaller organization, you may be able to build this and say, here it is. So here's the second half of that. So now we go through where it says, all right, yes, all those things are good. We're going to hit send. And it says, do you want to use that shipping address? Nope, we want to have a different one. Got it. And here's what our charge, so it calculates our charge, sales tax, asks for what kind of card they're going to use or payment. And so here it says we've stored a Visa account number. We're going to use that, and we're going to ship it out today. So again, there's our dialogue. There's how that interaction will hopefully play out, and we can look at the different options. And we build it out then in that storyboard. So again, very similar to checking out at Amazon. It's asking the same types of questions. Do I want to use my default address, or which one do I want to use? I put in the shipping address. I confirm whatever my payment is, and I can certainly change that. And then it says, all right, we use your store card. Your order will be shipped. And it gives you an order number and some tracking information. So there's that storyboard. It's still plain. It doesn't have a lot of colors. It doesn't have the logo. It doesn't have those kinds of things in it. So we need to make some decisions when we're doing this. So one of the biggest things we have to do, so are we building a custom application? So in other words, are we writing code that has to run on their system? Or are we doing it browser-based? And I will tell you that the idea of doing browser-based is increasingly more common than writing a custom application. Now, if I'm working with a legacy application, that may not be the same. But if I'm starting from scratch, more and more people are thinking, well, you know what? Let's just build this as a browser-based interface. Then I don't have to install on any of these end users' computers. It can be a very easy server-based application. So we need to think then, what devices will that user interface need to run on? So is it going to run on phones? Is it going to run on tablets? And so if it's an internal app only, maybe we don't need to worry about phones. Maybe it is only a desktop-based item. But we may need to think about what operating systems. Well, the advantage to having that browser-based is in a lot of cases, as long as we're not enabling some weird extension or something, it's neutral. It doesn't matter if my user has a Mac, if my user has a Linux operating system. If they're coming on with a phone with an Android operating system. If they've got an Apple phone, it doesn't matter. And so that browser-based really has a lot of advantages in today's systems. So we see a ton of that out there. So we need to think about that formatting for different interfaces. So in this case, we want to make sure that those forms look really good. We don't have this weird overlap of areas. And we see that a lot, especially on a smaller device. Suddenly we go to a website or we go to an interface and we go, oh man, this looks really horrible, because instead of playing nicely, that responsive design piece, and collapsing down into more rows, it just collapses. And so you have content on type of content. So we need to be careful of that. Making sure what the end users actually work on. And there may be times when they are using systems that are far older. So you actually have to build your system able to interact with an older version of a browser. Maybe that's the only one that that company will support for security reasons. Usually an odd way to do it, but it does happen quite a bit. So all those things like scroll bars, we want to make sure if that forces you to use them, that they are very available. And Blackboard falls down a little bit on that. So if I go to Blackboard on a tablet, especially like an Apple tablet or an Android tablet, the Grade Center is hideous. I can't get to anything. The scroll bars don't work. And so quite frankly, it's unusable from anything other than a Mac or a PC for me. So I can't just take my iPad and go, yeah, I'm going to do all the grading this weekend, because I can't get to it. Now they've built some apps. Bless you. You're apparently allergic to navigation and visibility. So we want to make sure that all those elements work. And you would think Blackboard would be really cognizant of how many users are coming in on mobile platforms. And for students, you can actually get to most of your stuff now with the Blackboard app. We still don't have the ability to go in and do a lot of the grading pieces with the Educator app. So it's just an idea when we look at that. We want to make sure these are done correctly. We want to make sure we understand if we're using lift boxes or combo boxes or radio buttons, what the differences are. So a checkbox, typically in a checkbox system, we just know I can have multiple checkboxes. In a radio button in a group, I can only have one option. And so I need to think about what my data entry points are. So if I need them to be able to check multiple things. So if I'm asking about students and I ask, are you male? There's probably only one box for that. But if I'm asking things about, are you active in campus groups? Check. Are you a commuter? You could have a check. So you might have to go to a checkbox system in a lot of cases to do that. So making sure that this appears very functional. So here's a little better example then. So here's our customer support system. So here we have, including this one's got product pictures, and it looks like it has the ability to have multiple pictures for an item. It's got information about the product, the size, color, and then we can actually come down here. Once you've looked at that particular item in a size 6 color red, it will actually show you things like how many are in stock, how many are on order, and if there are on order, what their due date is. So we can search by different keywords. So here it says for a parka with Velcro, we actually have 3 matches in our system. And so we could go through and we can look at them. So here you say, oh, yep, I'm going to add to my order. So this would be a screen that, for example, that salesperson would use, not you coming in on the web, because it's got some extra information there. Most of the time, vendors aren't going to show you how many items are in stock. They will say it's in stock or out of stock, but they usually don't give you specific numbers of those. So, Amazon does? For some things they will. And it depends on the company. Some companies aren't afraid to do that, but sometimes they can lie about that too. So sometimes they will put in a number that really means it's at a vendor's warehouse that they've got their system interconnected to. So again, here's our example of Amazon. Looks fairly contemporary, but again, I don't have things like back and forward. And you can see this if you do a search. Sometimes you go into Amazon or other sites, you lose all your search buttons and things when you pop up in another window, and you can see that. But prominently displayed is you can get the Amazon store card and get some small percentage off for giving them all of your control. So we have to think about it just like we do for a web page that we build. is where does this formatting and some of that go? We control the content, but the ultimate formatting is on that browser. And so we need to think about what browser settings. We need to be able to test ours on multiple browsers. And so that's where things like those VirtualBox and other things where we can spin up multiple versions of browsers are a really great way to try it. So data entry is on our programming piece, but how much of that is visible is really on that browser. And unfortunately, the bad thing to this, I said that's a great idea. Everybody's on a browser. What happens when browsers update? Then we have issues. But suddenly a page doesn't look right, and we have to update our code to fit the newer browsers. So one of them that's happening in a lot of cases now is the latest version, with the latest version of Chrome, anything that is not an HTTPS page comes up with these horrible warnings saying, this is not safe, don't put data in here. And for an internal web page, and you're going, man, what did my company do? Why do I get all these warnings? Why do I have to go to these redirects and all these things? So we're going to be forced in some cases to either say, you know what, you have to use Firefox, and Firefox will probably do something similar to Chrome, or we have to probably use certificates and actually make our internal sites even HTTPS. And that's not necessarily a bad, horrible thing, but it just adds one more layer of complexity in it. Now, if I have to do my websites internally that way, it also makes it easier for me then to push that website external if I need to. And so maybe I can come up with a website. So there are some examples, and so I actually pulled this website up for you. So if you want to ever see the worst example of a website, you guys may have done this in another class. So the milliondollarhomepage.com. Have you guys ever seen that before? Nobody forced you to go to this horrible website. So it's a clever idea. $1 a pixel. Now, think about this. He sold this for $1 a pixel. There's 1 million pixels on that screen, so it's 1,000 by 1,000 pixels. It's sold out. So, it's a horrible design for a web page, and so there are hundreds of links on there. Some of them will still work. Some of them are certainly gone, but if I click on, I'm trying to find one that might not be. So some of these are dead links. Yeah, that one looked like it was actually a dead link, and so it's going to land somewhere else. But there are tons of links that people have put on here. So, Book of Cool, coming 2016. Well, apparently it didn't ever manage to arrive. So, this is an example of a hideous, hideous layout for a website. If you do this in one of our classes, I'm pretty sure you'd fail. On the other hand, if you just sold it for $1 million, well, maybe there's a piece to that. But that's an example of some really bad layout that exists. And I wouldn't be surprised if that doesn't happen, then he goes, well, you know, that was a great idea. Let me do the 10 million page website. So you can actually, if you click on there or look for him, he's actually got a page on Twitter that you can get to. And he's got some other business ideas now. So hopefully we want simple, easy to read. So all of our items, very easy to read, very easy to change any of these items. We have a button to change. Oh, yeah, no, I changed my mind on the shipping. There are a lot of websites we go to in internal forums where once we make a decision, it's hard to go back and make a decision to change something. All right, crud, I hit the wrong shipping method, and it's very, very hard to come out of there. So descriptions are very easy, and in fact, we can change them. You can change the quantities, and then a very easy, very concise, yes, I do really want to pick this and buy it. But here's our newer challenge. Small keyboards. So even the best person, when they're texting on a phone, can't type as fast as they can or as accurately as they can on a conventional keyboard. How do I deal with that? Well, in a lot of cases, we use pictures for different things. We know that most of them have touchscreens, so we can use that to our advantage. Typically, although this is certainly changing, they have limited network capacity. But the reality is, that is even changing. So more and more customers are selecting to use unlimited data plans. And so they are able to download nearly as much data as possible. Now the flip side of that, we also have a growing number of consumers who are buying phones based on how cheap they can be. So there is an odd dichotomy. So you do need to think about who your target audience is. So if I'm selling a product like an iPhone X at $1,000 for a phone or more, probably I'm not as worried about it. If I'm selling used cheap textbooks to college students, well, maybe I need to keep my videos content down. I need to keep the amount of bandwidth I send at a much lower level. And so the screens and the phones also give us a couple of other things. So a challenge is this idea that I turn the phone, it rotates. And we've all seen apps that rotate really, really easily. We've also seen ones that don't scroll, they don't navigate well. We're going to run into that, so we need to be able to deal with it. We also have to deal with the fact that the Apple and the Android are two different models. And the Android model at this point, you can have phones running from 2 to version 8 of their software. Great. Apple, we have some older versions. I know people that are still using iPhone 4s. They work. So we need some way to get rid of things like accidental touches or fat fingering or accidentally dealing with, a dialing call or something weird. So back buttons are one of the most common things we do, some way to get back. So here's an example of what their home page on a small device would look like. And then we may need to think about larger devices like tablets. And so some of that could be our intended use. What are we going to do with it? A lot of times we can get by with the same interface for a phone to a tablet. It just looks a little big. If our goal is we're using those tablets as a production device, so think about UPS or FedEx, tablets make a lot of sense for them because they have a spot you can scroll on the screen. They can do a little easier searching than on a phone, maybe a little bigger keyboard. Maybe we need to make a separate interface for different models of tablets. And then certainly we have to worry about our desktop interface, what it's going to look like. In the desktop interface, one of the problems we have is most desktops don't have touchscreens. So we go from nearly everybody having a touchscreen environment to nobody having a touchscreen environment. And I have seen some desktop apps that really would look great, except they're so hard to use because they anticipate that you have a touchscreen. And they don't necessarily work well with maps. We also have this idea then on the back end of all these horrible things called reports. Everybody wants reports. They want to know what happens out of these applications, out of our system. And so a lot of times the same interfaces we use to create the form, we'll also create reports based on that. So we may have ones that run on some kind of a temporal event. In other words, based on time, they're going to pop up at some point in time. We may have ones that are at a manager's discretion. They might want to run one every day, or they may want to run one when they walk in the door. The most important one in some weird ways is something called an exception report. So this is the idea that we want to look at things that are outside the norm. So one of the best examples of that is our state. Our state likes to know things about you as a driver of an automobile. So it wants to know about drivers who have let their driver's license lapse. That's a kind of an important thing. Or even worse, that their insurance has lapsed. So if you have a registered car but not insurance, the state has kind of an interest in that. And that's probably a good thing. I don't want you driving if you don't have insurance. So if you run into me, my car doesn't get replaced, right? So we want those kinds of exception reports. And then we have that like dashboard view, a lot of times we call it. So those executive level reports. They don't want drilled down details. They don't want to know exactly how many widgets got sold. They want to know, compared to last year on a pie chart, are we selling more widgets than we did last year? So they want that high level view of our data. And so a lot of times part of our execution is creating those digital dashboards you're going to run into. So this is an example then of a shopping cart report. So here it says, this is what was ordered. These are the ways they went out, and this is a report on this particular order. We can also look at inventory reports. So here, a little bigger form, we can look at how many units we have in stock, how many units we need to reorder. So we're already putting some of these items at some kind of inventory level. So here we have size 13, tan, whatever it is, walking shoes. We have 921. When we hit an order level, an inventory of 100, we'll reorder. Now, it doesn't tell us how many we're going to reorder, so it doesn't have our target inventory in there. But that's kind of a basic idea of what we're looking at, being able to create is looking at that kind of data. So we may look at employees. So here we have an employee report where we're looking at this particular employee. What do they have? They get $50,000 in life insurance, $230,000 extra. Right now in their retirement plan, they've got $145,000, $6,000, whatever it is. They've got some kind of other plan, and they'd get that $255 from Social Security if they croak. So if this employee keeled over today, their spouse or survivor would get $460,000. I am not going to print one of those up for myself. My wife might decide that I am worth more gone than by being there. But we do those same kind of reports. So a lot of times those reports, especially if they're on screen versus printed, give us the ability to drill down or link into other reports. So a lot of times that executive desktop got big gauges looking things that you'll say, oh, it's got pie charts and graphs. If they click on the graphs, because maybe they are interested at that particular moment on, wow, we are not selling as many of these shoes as we did last year. A lot of times they can then drill down into it and they can actually view that. And if they can do that directly, so we build our system based around that, it saves you a lot of time from going in and saying, oh, I'll get that information for you, sir. And so it takes some time to build these ahead of time. But so, for example, here's that idea of a drill down. So here we have men's clothing winter. Well, that's just got the aggregate sales. Here we actually clicked on it. It's a hyperlink. And when we click on it, it will show them all of the items that were sold in men's clothing. So we sell a lot of winter parkas in this place. But it will also let you look at, in this particular case, it gets individual information from web, from telephone sales. We can look then at long-term trends and all those kinds of pieces. But again, this is a lot of times what we see on the executive dashboard. We'll see these charts and graphs. It's very easy to click and go, oh yeah, I can see that, our fall sales are pretty minimal, but in winter, they pick up, and I can look at last year compared to this year in a lot of cases. And that's a great way to get a ton of information very, very quickly. And so a lot of times at executive desktops, that's what we use for those kinds of systems. So this idea of that graphic user interface is very important. How do we make that user interface both friendly and usable? Because if it's not friendly, so we pick very mean, angry-looking fonts. And we've all seen the interfaces that look like they're from 1987. We use those. Again, we don't have that employee or that user buy-in, and we really need to do that. So we need contemporary design, but still usable. We don't want to necessarily throw in features that the swipe left, swipe right, without some kind of idea on how to use them. So graphic user interface is really one of those key features. How do we do it? There's thousands and thousands of books written on how do we actually design some of them, down to very minutiae detail about psychological results, we're not going to go nearly in that depth. All right, so just as a reminder then on Wednesday we are going to talk about graphic user design by building one. We're actually going to use a couple of products, and we're going to build our very own working application for a phone here in one day. In fact, shouldn't even take you all period to create one. It's that great and that easy. So once you see how you can do that, there's a lot of toolkits out there. You can build some very rudimentary devices out of a phone. So you could do sampling, or you could create a sample interface even before you maybe hired a programming team to build that final interface. And so we build a very complicated app. It may take a team and it may take a couple of months or longer to build, but we can create those templates or that mobile storyboard. And if you walk in with this mobile storyboard into your boss, that's a very effective way to sell a product and go, all right, we know it doesn't all work, but here's a sample right here for you. You can click on it, you can use it, interface with it. That's a great selling point when you're actually designing these